It was a gray and quiet morning on the outskirts of Berlin. Snowflakes drifted gently through the sky, resting softly on rooftops and silent streets. Inside a small, aging house at the edge of the neighborhood, an elderly woman sat beside a frosted window. Her name was Helga. She was 82 years old. Long ago, Helga had a family, a husband who once adored her, and 2 sons whose laughter once echoed through the rooms of her home. But time is rarely gentle. Her husband had passed many winters ago. Her sons had moved to other cities, too busy or too distant to visit anymore. Now Helga lived alone. Her pension barely covered her basic needs. Her knees ached from arthritis, and each winter, the cold seemed to grow colder. The roof above her bed leaked. Her heater only worked on certain days, and inside her refrigerator almost nothing. One night, wrapped in an old shawl, Helga sat at her table and wrote a letter. It wasn't addressed to a friend or to her family. She had no one left to write to. It was a plea, a whisper. "If anyone out there hears this," she wrote, "I just need a little help." The letter was sent to a local radio station. It was read aloud the next morning on air. Listeners were moved. Some shared the message on social media. Her words spread quietly. Like snow, but still, no one came. Until that letter landed on the desk of a man who wasn't known for sentiment but who understood the weight of silence. That man was Olaf Scholz. That morning, the German Chancellor was seated in his office, reviewing documents with a cup of tea in his hand. Among stacks of reports and agendas was Helga's letter printed and placed on top. He read it once, then again. And then, without a word, he stood up, looked out the window, and turned to his assistant. "Find this woman," he said softly. "I want to see her. Today." By afternoon, Scholz arrived in a quiet Berlin neighborhood. No cameras. No press. Just a few staff members and a cold breeze. They stopped in front of Helga's small home. The paint had chipped away. The mailbox hung open. Snow had gathered on the porch. Scholz stepped out of the car, wrapped in a dark coat and scarf. He walked to the door and knocked gently. From inside, a frail voice called out, "Please, I don't need anything. Leave me alone." He knocked again. "Mrs. Helga," he said calmly, "my name is Olaf Scholz. I read your letter." There was silence. Then, the door creaked open. Helga stood there, leaning on a wooden cane. Her hair was silver, tied back in a soft bun. Her eyes stared, but sharp stared up in disbelief. "Is it really you?" she asked, her voice shaking. Scholz nodded. "Yes," he said, "and I came to listen." He entered her modest home. They sat together in a living room filled with faded wallpaper and old photographs. The air was cold, but the warmth came slowly as Helga began to speak. She told him about her husband, about Sundays filled with baking, about her sons and how quiet the house had become after they left. She spoke of pain, of loneliness, of being invisible. Scholz said little. He didn't offer promises. He offered presence. When it was time to leave, he took her hand and said, "You are not forgotten, I promise you that." The very next day, Scholz held a private meeting with his cabinet. There were no headlines, no speeches, only action. He launched a national outreach initiative, one designed to find and support elderly citizens living in isolation. Funding was redirected. Social workers were assigned. Community nurses were mobilized. And Helga's name? It was the first on the list. Her home was repaired. Her heating was fixed. A nurse came by every morning with warm meals and medicine. She was no longer a shadow in her own city. She was seen. She was remembered. Months later, Helga sat in the courtyard of a peaceful care facility. The sun filtered through blooming trees. Birds chirped gently nearby. She wore a soft wool coat and held a cup of tea between her hands. Beside her, a young nurse read aloud from her favorite book. Helga looked to the sky, her voice barely above a whisper. "That day changed everything," she said. "I thought no one would come, but someone did, and I was never really alone after all." Back in Berlin, in the Chancellor's office, Olaf Scholz sat at his desk as the morning sun crept across the floor. Among his papers was a small handwritten card. "Thank you for seeing me, for hearing me, for remembering me." He picked it up, read it again,